Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Headlines with the Post and Courier's Education Lab. I'm Hilary Flynn, the editor of the unit. Thank you so much for joining us again for our discussion about how to support struggling students in South Carolina. I'm joined again by one of our senior reporters, Sara, and a brand new reporter to the lab, Devna. So Sara, do you first want to introduce yourself for those who haven't been in Beyond the Headlines before, and tell them a bit about yourself and what you cover?
Yeah, hello everybody. It's if you've joined before, it's nice to see you again. I'm a reporter based in Greenville for the lab, and I focus mainly on long-term feature projects and investigative work, looking at how schools in South Carolina can do a better job helping students. So I just wrapped up some reporting on mental health, and I'm working on a story right now about year-round schooling. So it's nice to be here.
And again, we have a brand new reporter to our unit, Devna. Do you want to tell them a bit about yourself, what you were doing before you joined the lab, where you're based, and everything?
Sure, yeah. So I'm from Mississippi, where both my parents are teachers. It's a proud fact I always tell. And my first job was in education reporting. Most recently, I was in Charlotte covering vulnerable communities and briefly covered ed. And I'm really happy to be here. I'll be covering primarily Charleston County schools, but we'll be helping out with some statewide stories like the one I worked on with Hillary.
Great. So as we mentioned before, for this session, we're going to be talking about how to support students in K through 12 schools in South Carolina. And the story we're going to start talking about first is one that Sara published a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, that looked at the mental health crisis in South Carolina schools and how one school district in particular was solving the problem by trying to get more in-person therapists into the school. So just to start out with, Sara, what got you interested in writing about mental health issues that students were experiencing? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. I've been reporting on education for a while now, and over the last few years, I've noticed this coming up in more and more of my interviews. Regardless of what we're talking about, it always seems to turn back to mental health and just the increase in needs that educators are seeing there, and it's just because it was such a sort of recurrent theme in everything that I was talking about. There were so many educators who, when I'd call them, we would be talking about the learning loss that students experienced during the pandemic, but it would all come back to mental health, right? Like it's hard to help a struggling student learn, English or math when there are these unmet mental health needs. And so I really wanted to explore that topic more. And the timing seemed right in South Carolina as the state, Governor McMaster made this a priority in his State of the State address in January. And legislators have been talking about it. And it's something that a lot of districts are, struggling to solve. And so I wanted to look for solutions that might help districts who want to help students.
So that's also like a problem that, well, we know from your reporting, but I'm sure people know anecdotally seems to be impacting school districts all across the state. And you decided to tell the story through the lens of one school district in particular, Cherokee County in the northern part of the state. Can you talk a bit about why you chose that school district, especially like because it's one that we haven't like frequently covered in the past?
Yeah. So, when I first started reporting on this, I talked with a lot of districts like around the state, and I just wanted to hear, what they were experiencing. And what I heard sort of over and over were that, these needs were pronounced in urban and rural areas, but rural areas have, a particular difficulty just with staffing. And so I really wanted to explore that a little bit deeper. And Cherokee is, is pretty similar to, they're dealing with, they're not an outlier, I guess. They're dealing with pretty much the same things that everyone is dealing with, but they were trying this this new approach, and it's actually something that the state has encouraged more districts to try, which is to use private providers to get more mental health therapists in schools. And it wasn't completely solving their problem, but it was making things better for them. And so I thought that that was a good place to look.
And with this, you again focused on one district, but you especially told the story through the eyes of a single person. Can you talk a bit in journalism, whenever we have people in our story, of course, we call them sources, but for this type of very in-depth narrative reporting, we also call them characters. Can you talk a bit about how you chose the main character for your piece and how you met her even to start out with?
Yeah, so I met Christina in that early round of reporting where I was just talking with lots of people. I think I read somewhere that a group of students had been, they held a panel to talk about mental health, and they were working on a podcast, and I was like, I want to hear more about that. And the first time I talked with Christina, she's just you can just tell how much she cares, and she's just a really dynamic, interesting person, and she's doing a lot to help. She's doing a lot that I wasn't able to write about. And she was just really open and really, really willing to spend a lot of time with me. And I'm enormously grateful for that, because I couldn't have told the story without her openness and all of the people that, she introduced me to talk to more. And so pretty early on, I think you and I started talking about how my reporting was going, and it just, she seemed like a sort of every woman type person dealing with the same problems that everyone has, but she's finding a way to make it work in her district. So.
Can you talk a bit about your reporting process, especially because I know from being your editor, but not everyone might be able to tell this from reading the stories, like how frequently you went to Cherokee, even just to observe different methods Christina was doing to really help tackle this problem, to see how the students were interacting with each other and with these types of solutions the districts that were coming up with, and even just how constantly connected you were to everyone in the area who was involved in this process over the course of several months. You spent a really long time on this story to be able to get this level of detail and really paint a picture of this community. Can you talk about sort of what that process was like?
Yeah, so I first started talking with Christina in February, and we first talked over Zoom. And I think I mentioned earlier, she's just a very busy person doing a lot of things. But she was talking to me from her car because she was driving between two schools that she was working at that day. And after that first conversation, we would text, we would have phone calls. Sometimes we'd have Zoom. I went up to Gaffney and Blacksburg a couple of times to do reporting. Some of those scenes made it into the story, and others didn't make it in the story, but they, helped me understand what they were doing better. And we really just kept in contact for the next several months. I mean, the story came out in late June, early July, and we talked pretty frequently that whole time period. And so some of the trips were I went and I was more focused on talking with high schoolers. Some of the trips I was more focused on talking with teachers. I spent one day at an elementary school looking at a wellness sort of event that she had organized, and the different lessons, I guess, that they were sharing with students. There was, mindful breathing, there was yoga, there was healthy food, things like that. So I really spent a lot of time just sort of watching and being a fly on the wall.
Can you talk a bit about your best reporting moment or your best reporting experience?
Yeah, so I always love being in classrooms the best. That's just that's where the magic happens. So I had I had two moments that like really stood out. One ended up not making it in the story, but the day that I spent at the elementary school, it was so cool to watch these students doing, these breathing exercises and yoga, and just like really seeing in the moment like how much they help students. I saw one student run up to her teacher after the end of the breathing exercise, and she was like, "I really need this. I've been stressed at home." And it just, you could see that it helped her. And that's a really powerful thing to witness, that, the next time she's stressed, now she has a tool that can help her. The other moment that was really powerful for me was sitting and talking with, just watching administrators at one of the middle schools as they were meeting with the woman who runs this counseling, this private counseling company that was going to be putting a counselor in the school. And it was the two guidance counselors at the school, the principal and Christina, and this woman who runs the private company. And so they were just sort of catching her up to speed on what this middle school had been experiencing up to this point in the year. And this was maybe April, early April. And just listening to them about all of everything they were dealing with was just really powerful to hear. Like I just walked away feeling like I really understood the depth of what schools were dealing with. And I also was just really grateful that I'd been invited to, watch that moment happen. It helped me tell the story better, I think.
Perfect. So Sarah's story, it actually came out with a collection of stories. For those who don't know, our education lab is actually a member of the Education Lab Collaborative, which is a coalition of education labs all across the country from outlets like the Dallas Morning News, AL.com, and every couple of months we release a series. This one looked at the mental health crisis in K through 12 and higher education schools, with a focus on not just addressing, like writing about how the issue's happening, but focusing on concrete solutions, evidence-based solutions to the problem, or even ones where there's enough like anecdotal evidence that to show, like, give strong signs that it's working. So as this collaborative is actually hosting an event next week to connect to even more people and get the word out about both the solution in Sarah's story, but also in the other solution, in the other stories, which you can check out on our website. Sarah, can you talk a bit about that event?
Yeah, so we're just going to be talking more about our reporting process and talking more about solutions. I think there's going to be a student and some experts on the panel as well. So it's not just going to be reporters talking, but it should be really interesting.
But you'll be talking again, right?
I will, yes.
So any super fans of Sarah out there, come join. Or even if you aren't a super fan, but just a fan. So just come attend. Another story that we're going to discuss today that actually we're giving you a sneak peek for, that's because it's not going to come out online until this weekend, is a piece that me and Devna worked on about security in K through 12 schools in the state. As many of you know, stories about mass shootings in K through 12 schools, or shootings in general, have really gripped headlines. And this issue has been brought to attention again after the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, pretty recently. In the wake of that, what we've been noticing is that many of the largest school districts in the state are increasing their school security measures. In particular, they're adding metal detectors to the schools. Some are doing more random searches and are using these other methods. However, what we know from previous reporting, from talking to countless amounts of experts in the field, is many of these methods are kind of like band-aid solutions to the problem, or worse, not even band-aids. They actually can do more harm than good. what we really found is that metal detectors, for example, even though some districts are investing hundreds and thousands of dollars to get them in schools, they don't actually make schools safer. What really does make schools safer is these in-depth relationships between teachers and students, outreach to students' homes, and especially investing in students' mental health resources. And Devna talked to a panel of experts who really looked at this issue in Los Angeles after several years ago, after a different mass shooting in Parkland gripped the country. Obviously, Los Angeles is pretty far away from Parkland, but they want to, like, after this dominated national headlines, they really wanted to see what were the best preventative measures to stop this from happening in their schools. So, Devna, can you talk a bit about what you learned from like this panel? Can you tell like what the panel is to start out with?
Sure, yeah. So it was assembled by the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office, and it kind of was composed of experts from all different backgrounds to touch on all of these different fields. And so there were people who are experts in mental health and government and public safety, and they met several times together and with the community over several months, and then came up with 33 recommendations. 10 of them they kind of described as their major ones. But yeah, a few of their findings were that, you know, the LA Sheriff's Department, the police department, the school police should kind of consolidate their safety plans. They found that mental health was a huge component of this in both, you know, preventing, and they had some findings related to the mental health of school attackers as well. And one of their bigger recs was that LA should establish a school safety director job.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk a bit about what it was like interviewing sources for the piece, especially because, again, you said like they weren't just getting school district officials, they weren't just getting law enforcement. Something that they did that was pretty innovative was getting these mental health experts on the panel. Like they knew that, you know, the answer wasn't just like security measures or law enforcement type measures in these schools. It was to address sort of the base layer of these issues. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, right. So I, in trying to report this out, I reached out to everyone on the panel practically, and a few people got back to me. The main person I interviewed was Dr. Marlene Wong, who's a leading, you know, one of the country's leading experts on mental health and trauma in schools. She helped develop what's known as CBI. And yeah, so she talked to me a lot about, you know, what she thought what the panel's major findings were in her eyes. And it was that, you know, a lot of these things like metal detectors are kind of reactive when so much more preventative work is needed. You know, one of the things that stuck out to her and me in this reporting is that at least one person knew in many of these school shootings or attacks beforehand, and having an adult connection with every student or having every student on campus have a connection with an adult goes a long way in preventing that.
Can you also talk about what they found about the school district's search policy that existed prior to the creation of this panel, correct?
Yes. So in those community meetings that they had with, you know, stakeholders like parents, teachers, students, at every meeting, Dr. Wong said they, you know, spoke out against this policy in which the LA school district was searching students. And this kind of deteriorated that adult relationship, you know, between students and staff, because you know, the searches seem to be not all that random. And a study was published about these searches that kind of back that up. So yeah, there was a lot of controversy about that, and they weren't all that helpful. A lot of the things that they were finding, they were not finding weapons that often, from what I can remember, and when they weren't guns.
Mhm. By not that random, it also gets on an important layer of what a potentially harmful consequence of this increased security and increased surveillance is in these schools, which is like the demographic component of it. Like there have been countless studies that have shown that, you know, when there are search policies at these schools, the students who tend to be searched more are minority students. And again, with metal detectors, those do exist even though, again, they found that they're not really very useful in finding any weapons. It's mostly something for school district administrators and politicians to point to, saying like, oh, hey, look, there's like a physical metal detector at the front of the school, so that school's safe now. But they exist more in schools with a minority heavy student population. Do you want to expand a bit on that, how the demographic component of this, especially like the racial background, is an important part of this conversation about school security with school like increased sort of law enforcement type security measures versus mental health resources?
Sure. I mean, that's kind of the fine line that educators, that the education system kind of has to figure out. It's this line between students feeling over policed, feeling like school is, you know, I've heard students complain that school feels like a prison, and that's definitely not what you want. That's not a conducive environment to learn. And so and when, you know, Black and brown students are, you know, searched the most, those schools have the most metal detectors, that of course deteriorates again that relationship between students and people who work there and are trying to teach them. And so the main thing I kind of took away from this report was that there needs to be a unified approach to school safety. It's not just metal detectors, it's not just counselors, it's everyone being involved. Even school resource officers can be helpful when they emphasize that relationship between them and a student and making that connection. So sort of all of these things are needed to really change safety in schools.
All right, so let's get into some questions from the audience right now. So we already kind of touched on this a bit, but one of the attendees, Jennifer Rainville, asked, what do we need to do about the desire to spend excessive funds on police in schools when what we need are more mental health services and social workers? Who wants to take that question? I know that we've already discussed this, but Sarah, do you want to talk about like this increased need and how like funds from our reporting, it seems like funds should be dedicated towards mental health and social services for students?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point here is that it's not like an either or thing. It's that all of these things can help in certain ways, right? But I mean, I just to elaborate on, you know, the point that Devna made a few minutes ago. I mean, those relationships really matter. I've talked with a lot of students, and one of the things I like asking them is like, who's the adult at your school that you trust, or do you have an adult at your school that you trust? And it can be anybody. It's not just a teacher or a mental health counselor. It can be the bus driver who is the first person that they see in the morning. One student I talked to said that on the first day of high school, she really bonded with the lunch lady and she was like, I just knew I was going to like her. Like, I like food, you know, she serves food, like, and she just like, that's her person. And she feels better about being in high school because she knows she has that person she can trust. And so it's, you know, it's not like an either or. It's not just do metal detectors. It's not just invest in mental health services and social workers. It's how do you do both in moderation? And of course, that's, you know, it's easy to talk about theoretically and a little bit harder when there are, you know, limited funds available that districts are having to figure out how to use that money. But I mean, I do think the research shows that a lot of this technology is not as effective as they might hope it would be. So.
Devna, do you have anything else to add?
Sure. Yeah. One thing that Dr. Wong kind of said to me was that when they, looked into the profile of, or they actually couldn't find one profile of people who attack schools, but one of the things that they found in common with all of them is that, they didn't have that person in school, that they were the students that, that didn't have a connection with an adult on campus, that were sort of left behind. So that's just another point that kind of that underlines the need.
Perfect. And we have another question from Debbie Edmonds. She's asking, does the state of South Carolina require that each school have a mental health counselor? Sarah, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so there is not a requirement that there is a mental health counselor. There are, these often get conflated. There are requirements for guidance counselors, but there are not for mental health counselors who get a different type of training. So about half of the schools in South Carolina have mental health therapists. That's down a little bit from its high, but it's always hovered at about that point. And so one of the things that the state has said it wants to do is that it wants to increase that. And they're looking at increasing it based on the ratio of counselors to students, not necessarily counselors to schools. Because if you have, a very large, 2,000 person high school, you might need more than one counselor per school. But right now there aren't any requirements. And that's something that they're actively working on increasing.
Yeah, 2,000 students was as big as my college, so that is a very large high school. Okay, perfect. If anyone else has any questions, please submit them now. And yeah, that might be all the questions we have for right now. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, Devna is our new reporter. She's covering Charleston County right now. Devna, do you want to tell them what your email address and what your Twitter handle are, just so people can reach out to you for tips, just in case that you're just want to discuss education in especially Charleston County in particular?
Sure. Yeah. My handle on Twitter is just my name, as you can see spelled here, DEVNABOSE. And my email is D, my first initial, my last name, BOSE @postandcourier.com.
We also have a brand new Education Lab newsletter that you can sign up with. We're sending around a link with the recap of this event. And we also launched a Twitter that we are encouraging everyone to follow if you want to stay up to date with the latest Education Lab stories at the very moment they're published. So thank you everyone for attending, and I hope you attend the next one and reach out to us anytime.